All right, let's dive into 19th century India and really get into the thick of things with the events of 1857.
Yeah, this is one of those events that goes by a bunch of different names.
You'll hear mutiny, rebellion, even War of Independence thrown around.
Exactly.
So by the end of this deep dive,
You'll have all the info you need to decide for yourself what you want to call it.
it's interesting how it all starts with this company, the British East India Company.
Not even the British government at first, huh?
Not even close.
They went from a small trading operation to basically running a huge part of India.
How does a company end up in charge of a whole nation?
Right. That's some serious power play right there.
It really is.
Well, it didn't happen overnight, that's for sure. It was a slow burn, took centuries, actually.
Centuries, wow.
They started small, just trading posts here and there, but they were clever about it, formed alliances, and let's be real, they got pretty aggressive with their expansion.
So it wasn't all peaceful tea and crumpets then.
Not exactly.
One of the sources mentioned these subsidiary alliances.
Oh, yeah, those are interesting.
What was that all about?
Okay, so imagine you're a local ruler, right?
Okay.
And the company comes along and they're like, hey, we'll protect you from your enemies, no problem.
Sounds good so far.
But there's a catch. You just got to pay us and let us set up our troops here.
Oh, there it is.
Seems like a decent deal at first, but then you realize you're losing your independence bit by bit.
It's like a slow takeover.
Exactly. And it created a ton of resentment, not just among the rulers themselves,
Right.
among the Indian soldiers serving in the company's army, the sepoys.
Right. And it wasn't just about losing territory, was it? There was a religious aspect to it, too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Don't forget, the company was a Christian organization,
Right.
operating in a place that was mostly Hindu and Muslim.
So you can see how that would lead to some tension.
Big time. People were afraid of being forced to convert, especially with all these missionaries running around.
So the sepoys were stuck between a rock and a hard place.
They had their loyalty to the army, but also their own faith.
That's a tough spot to be in.
You said it. And the company didn't exactly have a great track record of respecting local customs and beliefs.
Like that incident we talked about earlier, the Velour Mutiny back in 1806. Wasn't that
Yeah.
about uniforms?
Yep, the company tried to force these new regulations on the sepoys.
Like what kind of regulations?
Things like how they wore their turbans, facial hair, that kind of stuff. Things that were really important to their religious identity.
I can see how that would cause problems.
Yeah, it was a huge mess. Foreshadowed the bigger issues that were brewing.
So we've got land grabs, religious anxieties, and a whole army that's feeling increasingly alienated. Not a good combination.
No, not at all. And right into this boiling pot of tension, the company throws in something that really sets things off. The new Enfield rifle cartridges.
Ah, yes. The infamous greased cartridges. I remember reading about those. Weren't they rumored to be greased with animal fat?
That's right, beef and pork fat to be specific.
Oh, wow.
So imagine you're a Hindu sepoy. You're not supposed to eat beef. Or a Muslim sepoy who can't touch pork.
Right.
And suddenly you're being told to bite open these cartridges greased with something that's either sacred or forbidden to you.
I see where this is going.
It was like a direct attack on their beliefs.
So was this really the main thing that kicked off the rebellion?
It was definitely the catalyst, the thing that lit the fuse.
Right.
But the real issues had been simmering for decades.
So the cartridges were just the tipping point.
Exactly. They brought all those underlying tensions to the surface and boom, rebellion.
So it wasn't just one single cause, more like a whole bunch of things that came together.
Absolutely. The cartridges were the immediate trigger, but you can't ignore all that resentment over land annexation, the fear of religious interference, and just the general discontent within the army.
It sounds like the company was playing a dangerous game.
They were, and they were about to learn a very hard lesson about pushing people too far.
And speaking of people, the sepoys themselves weren't a monolithic group, right? Did their backgrounds play a role in all of this?
That's a really important point. You see, the Bengal army, which made up a big chunk of the company's forces, wasn't just any army. It was heavily influenced by things like the caste system and regional loyalties.
So it wasn't just a simple Indian soldiers versus British officers situation.
Nope, not at all. The company had a very specific way of recruiting soldiers.
Like what?
They favored certain castes and regions over others.
Interesting.
For example, a lot of the sepoys came from the state of Oud, which had recently been annexed by the company.
So they had a personal stake in all this.
Exactly. They had every reason to be angry.
So we're talking about a really complex situation here.
Very complex. And this internal diversity within the army had a huge impact on how the rebellion unfolded. It shaped alliances, rivalries, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, so we've set the stage. We've got this powerful company with some questionable policies, simmering discontent among their soldiers, and then boom, these controversial cartridges hit the scene. What happens next?
Well, things were definitely tense. You could feel it in the air. It was like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
Yeah.
And that spark came in the form of a single sepoy.
Mangal Pandey.
Mangal Pandey, that's right.
He's considered a hero by a lot of people, right?
Absolutely. He became a symbol of resistance against the British. And what's really interesting is that Pandy wasn't just focused on the cartridges.
Yeah.
He was really troubled by all of the company's policies, the way they were eroding traditional Indian values.
So he was more like a symbol for a bigger movement.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He was the spark that ignited a much larger flame.
So what did he do?
Well, on March 29th, 1857, Pandy decided he'd had enough.
Oh,
He marched right onto the parade ground, armed and ready to fight.
wow.
He called on his fellow sepoys to join him, to rebel against the British. He said they were trying to destroy their religion.
That's pretty brave, standing up to the entire British establishment like that.
It was an act of defiance that really resonated with the other sepoys.
So what happened?
Well, he was quickly overpowered and executed.
Oh, wow.
But even though he died, his actions sent shockwaves through the entire company army.
It was a sign that things were about to change.
Exactly. The sepoys were done tolerating the way things were.
So Mangal Pandey was the first domino to fall.
You could say that.
What happened after that? Where did things go from there?
Well, the next big event was in Meerut.
Meerut.
It's a large military cantonment north of Delhi, and this is where the rebellion really exploded.
Hmm.
In April 1857, 85 sepoys from the 3rd Bengal Light Cavalry refused to use the new cartridges.
These were the cartridges that weren't even greased with animal fat anymore, right?
Right. The company tried to backpedal on that decision, but the damage was already done.
The trust was broken.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The sepoys saw right through it. They thought the British were trying to trick them.
And they weren't going to stand for it.
Nope. It was a direct challenge to the company's authority.
So how did the company react to that?
Force. They cracked down hard.
What did they do?
They court-martialed the sepoys who refused, stripped them of their uniforms, sentenced them to 10 years hard labor.
10 years. That's rough.
It was supposed to be a show of force, a way to scare the other sepoys into line.
But it didn't work.
Not even close. It actually had the opposite effect.
How sad.
Seeing their comrades publicly humiliated like that, it just fueled the anger and resentment even more.
And that's what led to the full-blown rebellion in Meerut.
That's right. On May 10th, 1857, the Meerut sepoys rose up in open revolt.
What did they do?
They broke into the jail, freed their imprisoned comrades, attacked British officers and civilians.
It was the start of something big.
It was. The rebellion had begun.
Some of the sources describe some pretty intense scenes in Meerut.
Oh, yeah. It was chaos. Pure bloodshed. The sepoys were tearing down anything that represented British power.
I bet it was terrifying for anyone caught in the middle of all that.
It was a complete collapse of order. And once Meerut fell, the rebellion spread like wildfire throughout northern India.
And Delhi was one of the most important targets, right?
Absolutely. Delhi was the former capital of the Mughal Empire.
Right.
It held a ton of symbolic importance. The rebel sepoys marched on Delhi, hoping to rally support and establish a base.
So they were fighting for more than just pushing back against the East India Company.
Yeah, for some of them it was about reviving the Mughal Empire.
But the sepoys were a diverse group, weren't they?
Yeah.
Did they all have the same goals?
That's a great question. And the answer is not really. Some saw the Mughal Emperor, Bahadur Shah II, as a figurehead they could all unite behind.
Okay.
But others were more focused on local grievances.
So it was a mixed bag.
It was. But in the end, Bahadur Shah II did end up supporting the rebellion.
He did.
Yeah, the sepoys proclaimed him the Emperor of Hindustan.
Wow.
They were hoping it would legitimize their cause and bring in more support.
So Delhi became like the headquarters for the rebellion.
Basically. So how did the British respond to all of this?
Well, I imagine they weren't too happy about it.
You're telling me. At first, they were caught off guard. They totally underestimated the scale and intensity of the uprising.
But they eventually got their act together, right?
Oh, yeah. They mobilized troops from all over India, sent reinforcements from Britain.
And then the siege of Delhi began.
That's right. One of the most important battles of the entire rebellion.
What can you tell us about that?
Well, it was brutal. Lasted for months. The British forces surrounded the city, bombarded it day and night.
The sepoys inside weren't giving up easily, though.
No way. They were determined to hold their ground. The fighting was fierce.
The sources paint a pretty grim picture of what life was like inside the city.
Yeah, it was awful. Supplies were running low, disease was spreading, the constant threat of bombardment. It was hell on earth for everyone involved.
So the Siege of Delhi was a major turning point.
Definitely. The British eventually recaptured the city in September 1857, but it came at a huge cost.
A lot of lives lost on both sides.
Exactly.
But the fighting didn't stop there, did it?
No, the rebellion continued to rage in other parts of India, especially in the north and central regions.
And one of the most tragic and controversial events happened in Kanpur.
Kanpur, now known as Kanpur.
Right, Kanpur is known for the massacres that happened there.
Yes, it was a truly horrific chapter in the rebellion.
How did it start?
Well, it began with a siege. Rebel forces led by Nana Sahib, a Maratha leader who had his own issues with the company, surrounded a British entrenchment.
So the rebellion was attracting all sorts of people with their own agendas.
Exactly. It became a focal point for anyone who had a problem with British rule. Nana Sahib saw it as a chance to regain power and influence.
So what happened in Kanpur?
Well, the British were trapped inside the entrenchment. They were running out of food and ammunition.
So they surrendered.
They did. They negotiated a surrender with Nana Sahib.
And he agreed.
He promised them safe passage to Allahabad. That promise was broken.
The Satachora Ghat massacre.
Yes. As the British were evacuating, chaos broke out. Hundreds of men, women, and children were killed on the banks of the Ganges River.
There are conflicting accounts of what exactly happened.
Right. There are. Some sources blame the rebels for starting the massacre. Others say it was just panic and misunderstanding. But the outcome was undeniably tragic.
Horrible. And what about the survivors?
The women and children who survived the massacre were taken captive.
And held in the Bibihar.
Yes. And that's where the second massacre happened.
Just a few days later.
As British forces were closing in on Kanpur, the captives at Bibihar were brutally murdered.
The events at Kanpur had a massive impact on how the rest of the rebellion played out.
Absolutely. They fueled anti-rebel sentiment among the British. It became about revenge. They were determined to crush the uprising no matter what.
It was a turning point in the conflict.
For sure. The rebellion entered a new, much more brutal phase.
These individual events, these moments of extreme violence, they really shaped the entire narrative of the rebellion.
They did. It's a reminder of the human cost of conflict, how quickly violence can spiral out of control.
So after Kanpur, what happened next?
The British eventually regained control, but it took time and a lot more bloodshed. The road to restoring order was long and painful.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive so far, from the early signs of trouble to the outbreak of violence and the horrific events at Kanpur.
Yeah.
But what happened after the rebellion was finally put down? What was the aftermath like?
Well, you could say it was a major turning point for India. The rebellion had a huge impact on the country's future. It led to some pretty significant changes, politically, socially, and militarily. And we'll delve into all of that in the next part of our deep dive.
So after more than a year of fighting, how did the rebellion actually end?
Well, the British did eventually win, but it was a tough fight.
Right, because they were going up against trained sepoys, not just some random mobs.
Exactly. And a lot of those sepoys had support from local rulers and even some civilians.
It was a real challenge for the British to regain control.
They had to rethink their whole military strategy.
Because brute force alone wasn't going to cut it.
Nope. They realized they had to address the root causes of the rebellion, too.
I remember some of the sources mentioned guys like Colin Campbell and Hugh Rose.
Oh, yeah. Those were some key figures for the British.
What made them so successful?
Well, they took a more coordinated approach.
What do you mean?
They didn't just focus on fighting battles. They also worked on things like securing key cities.
Okay.
And establishing clear communication lines.
So basically cutting off the rebels and making it hard for them to coordinate.
Exactly. If you can't communicate, you can't organize a rebellion.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And they also started using local intelligence more effectively.
Yes. They needed to understand what the rebels were thinking and what their plans were.
It became a war of attrition as much as anything else.
Exactly. The rebels just couldn't keep up in the long run.
They ran out of steam.
In a way, yeah. They didn't have the resources or the leadership to fight a long war against a determined British force.
And once some of their key leaders were captured or killed, that was pretty much it for the rebellion.
Pretty much. It lost momentum.
So what happened after the rebellion was over? What was the aftermath like for India?
Well, it was a huge turning point. It marked the end of the East India Company's rule in India.
Really? So the rebellion actually led to the company's downfall?
It did. The British Crown stepped in and took direct control.
That's kind of ironic, isn't it? The rebels were trying to push back against British rule, and they ended up strengthening it.
It is ironic, but that's how history works sometimes. It's full of unintended consequences.
So the company was out and the British government was in.
Exactly. And they were determined to do things differently. They had seen firsthand how badly the company had messed things up.
So they implemented a bunch of reforms to try and prevent another rebellion.
Exactly. The army was completely reorganized. They changed their recruitment policies to focus on groups they saw as more loyal, like the Sikhs and Grikas.
And what about the sepoys who had been fighting for the company?
Well, they weren't exactly trusted anymore.
So they were sidelined.
Basically, the British Army became more of an occupying force than a collaborative one.
That must have been a tough pill to swallow for the sepoys who had been loyal to the company for years.
It was, and it had long-term consequences for the relationship between the British and the Indian people.
It created this underlying tension that would eventually lead to the Indian independence movement.
You got it. But the reforms weren't just about the military.
What else did they change?
They also made some political and social changes.
Like what?
Well, they started involving Indians in local governance and administration.
Really?
Yes, but mostly just the elite classes.
So it was a very controlled form of inclusion.
It was, but it did open up some opportunities for Indians to participate in the colonial system.
And it also led to the establishment of universities in some of the major cities.
Exactly, cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras.
And these universities played a key role in the Indian independence movement later on.
Right. They did. They helped create a new generation of educated Indians who were ready to fight for their freedom.
So even though the rebellion was ultimately crushed, it had a lasting impact.
It did. It forced the British to change the way they ruled India, and it planted the seeds for future change.
We've talked about the causes of the rebellion, the key battles, the aftermath, but there's one more thing we need to address.
What's that?
The name itself.
Yes. The whole mutiny versus rebellion versus war of independence debate.
Exactly. Which one is it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer.
Because it depends on your perspective.
Exactly. The British at the time saw it as a mutiny, plain and simple.
A betrayal by their own troops.
Right. But from the Indian perspective, it was a fight for freedom.
A struggle against an oppressive foreign power.
Exactly. And as historians have studied the events of 1857, they've realized that it's much more complicated than that.
It wasn't just a simple uprising.
Nope. It was a mix of different factors. A clash of cultures. A power struggle that defies easy categorization.
So how should we think about it? What should we call it?
Well, I think it's important to understand all the different perspectives.
Okay.
And to recognize that no single label can fully capture the complexity of what happened.
It's a reminder that history is messy.
It is, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
The Indian Rebellion of 1857 was a pivotal moment in Indian history, and the debates and interpretations continue to this day.
They do, and they probably always will.
Well, that's a great note to end on, I think.
Yes, I think so too.
You've given us a lot to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Indian Rebellion of 1857.
It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening out there, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive as much as I did. We've only scratched the surface of this complex and fascinating event, but I hope we've sparked your curiosity to learn more.
There's so much more to discover.
And remember, you're now more informed than most people about the Indian Rebellion of 1857. Go out there and impress your friends.